to start with Rachel Salzman, who wrote about Russia, the BRICS, and all sorts of related matters. We will then hear from the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, about his book on the evolving world disorder, which is new to us, and so it's a very timely publication. And finally, from Karthik Nachiappan, who has a book out called Does India Negotiate? A wonderful title, and I'm sure a wonderful book. So, and first, perhaps a word of appreciation to Ritika, who has been looking after the book events here, and through her, a word of thanks to Samir and the whole team. They've done a truly fantastic job of organizing us all into different sessions, different times. I go to a number of conferences, and this one is uniquely rich, diverse, young, and altogether admirable. So Rachel, your book you took a lot of time with, which is wonderful. The advantage of a doctoral thesis is you can take time, and it's now come out as a book, a handsome book from Georgetown University Press. And I wanted to ask you first, what made you think of your topic, Russia and the BRICS and everything relating to that?
Certainly, and let me echo the thanks to the organizers, and I'm just very excited to be here and to be talking about the book. You know, that's a question I get a lot as an American looking at BRICS. So I always like to say first I'm a Russianist, and that my background is in Russian history, and my PhD is in political science looking specifically at Russia. And where this came from was a real fascination with questions about how Russia engages with the international system, especially since the end of the Cold War, and efforts to create new institutions, particularly in instances where Russia might feel alienated from the dominant ones. And this is true, of course, in the Euro-Atlantic space with NATO and the European Union. Now, I also happen to have a stroke of, certainly not luck, but intervention of fate, where I defended my prospectus in December of 2013. And for those of you who might mark time by the crisis in Ukraine, 2 months later was, of course, the annexation of Crimea. And 2 months after that, I appeared in Moscow for 8 months to start looking and doing dissertation research. And I realized that while I was initially going to look at BRICS almost as an endpoint in 2008 with the global financial crisis, what was a lot more interesting was looking at how Russian leaders have used the idea of BRICS over time, and also in particular, after the onset of the crisis in Ukraine, once you start seeing sanctions from the European Union, from the United States, and ways that that played into Russian foreign policy. And then in the book, I've sort of expanded that out because, of course, Russia doesn't perform its BRICS policy in a vacuum. And if you look at BRICS, the two countries that are closest geographically and have the longest historical relationships are China and India. So I've also included a chapter on those countries and how they think about BRICS, as well as a chapter on looking at what BRICS itself is, an intellectual history of the institution, if you will.
Now, let's talk about the two countries you mention at the moment, China and India. Both China and India very important to Russia and to everybody else nowadays. One of the strengths of BRICS was that it involved Russia, and for hard-charging developing countries when it was created. Some of them are a bit economically becalmed at the moment, but the emergence of BRICS was a very exciting moment, and I think BRICS as a forum does continue to matter to each of them. And perhaps you could tell us a bit more about your perspective on that.
Sure. I would first say that BRICS, when it was created, had 3 other hard-charging developing countries. South Africa did not join until they formally joined
Yes.
in December of 2010 and then attended their first summit in December of 2011. I point that out because I think it's important in marking the evolution of BRICS as a fully distinct political forum as compared to its roots in other forums. We heard from Minister Lavrov yesterday on the Russia, India, China strategic triangle. You have also, of course, the India, Brazil, South Africa Dialogue Forum, IBSA. And then BRIC, small s, starts meeting at Putin's behest at the deputy foreign minister level at 2005. Things progress. You get the financial crisis. You see the BRIC countries acting as a really important pressure group within the G20. And I think 2008 to 2010 is the high point in terms of impact on the international stage. And then you see they continue to work together even as the crisis starts to calm down, even as the G20 replaces what was then still the G8 and is now again the G7. And so a lot of the calls about revisions of international order in the global economic order are not met precisely, but are beginning to be addressed. And yet the BRICS countries start realizing that cooperation has its own benefits. The other thing I would say is that one of the enormous strengths of BRICS as a forum is precisely its flexibility. You mentioned that India and Brazil are very important to BRICS. That's absolutely true. What India and Brazil get out of BRICS, I would argue, is quite different, or India and China, my apologies, but true also for Brazil. What India and China get out of BRICS is quite different from what Russia gets out of BRICS, either in its initial phases or as we look now to a forum that has a decade plus of history. And the ability of the 5 countries at this point to maneuver around each other, keep up the, I wouldn't say facade, but keep up the minimum level of cooperation for it to still be a functioning forum, to have annual leader summits, and no country has ever missed a leader summit, and we've had leadership transitions in all of the countries at this point. But no one really gets in the way of each country pursuing what it wants out of the forum.
Yes.
And I also think that that's something that as Western scholars, a lot of us miss, right? That certainly if I think about my training on international institutions or organizations, one of the things we think about, and I think this is particularly true in the US and post-Cold War, is alliances of values, coalitions of democracies, market economies, all of these. And that's very much how you're trained to think about a successful organization. And BRICS is not institutionalized to the point of many of the Western-led institutions, not by a long shot. But it is very successful at cooperating at a high level of abstraction where it has common goals and sort of slaloming around the rest and not letting profound disagreements hinder cooperation that is possible in other areas.
And to mention one of those disagreements, which was quite lively when I was beginning to think about the Indian foreign policy, Brazil and India, which in the multilateral sphere always seek to work closely together, on the critical WTO talks in 2008, were the 2 countries that wound up disagreeing very strongly with each other in the key small negotiating forum, bringing the talks to a deadlock. So it's not as if they always agree. On critical things they can disagree, but your assessment that they have weight, and they have more weight together, and they matter, I think that's absolutely convincing. Now, it does hinge on continuing to work with each other more than formalistically. And I wanted to ask you about your assessment of where they are today.
Sure. I would say that BRICS today are less dynamic than they were when I was finishing the dissertation, which was in 2015. I think they're certainly less useful to Russia than they were at that point. And Russia, just by sheer stroke of luck in the calendar, had the chairmanship in 2015. So right when you are seeing them in the eye of the storm, if you will, of efforts to isolate them on the international stage, sanctions, real opprobrium from the West over actions in Crimea and the Donbass in Ukraine, you have them chairing this quite dynamic forum with some of the major leaders of the global economy and those who will be future political leaders. That is less true now, and I think that is partly because both China and India, for different, although not disconnected reasons, have both decided that BRICS it was never their premier international forum, but it is less useful to what they wish to achieve on the international stage than it might have been in, let's say, not only 2010, but 2012, 2013. Russia, also kind of reading the tea leaves there, has moved on a bit as well. You heard Minister Lavrov talk about the Greater Eurasia yesterday. This is an idea that has come in numerous different forms over the past 30 years, give or take. There's the Greater Eurasia Partnership, which is somehow part of the Eurasian Economic Union. There's an extent to which it maybe is possibly a way for Russia to link in with the Belt and Road Initiative as sort of an organizing principle within post-Soviet Central Asia. But the upshot is that all three of these countries have decided that BRICS is still useful, but not as useful. Similarly, Brazil obviously underwent several years of significant political and economic turmoil domestically, which just creates a bandwidth issue. It's not that Brazil is not interested in BRICS, it's that when you're going through financial crisis, impeachment, corruption scandals, things like that, it's perhaps harder to focus. And similarly in South Africa, you saw a lot of turmoil towards the end of President Zuma's time in office. So I think, just to sort of close the thought, it is still important. You do still have numerous working groups. Each year, some 100 meetings happen of the working groups at the ministerial and the sub-ministerial level. I would argue that sub-ministerial meetings are actually pretty indicative of real work, because that's where the work gets done if you move lower down in the ministries. That having been said, I think there is a lot of paper and somewhat less immediate action, but they have proved that when they decide to do something, it does happen. And the creation of the new development bank and the contingency reserve arrangement in 2014, both of which were ideas that had been percolating for some time within the group, are evidence that they are capable of forming sort of hard institutions if all 5 members decide it is in their collective interest.
Indeed. Now, I think a number of the bilateral relationships remain strong, particularly at leader level. So, for example, President Bolsonaro will be in Delhi in less than 10 days, I think, to participate in the iconic parade. And so the relationship between Mr. Modi, Mr. Bolsonaro is a very strong one. So I think the forum often helps create personal relationships amongst leaders, ministers, deputy ministers, as you say, that actually wind up mattering quite a lot.
It does, and certainly in my work I've thought a lot more about the Putin-Xi relationship than I have necessarily about the Modi-Bolsonaro relationship. But it is a similar idea, right? For Putin and for Russia, having a strong relationship with China, independent of BRICS, is enormously important at the moment, not just for trade reasons and not just for broader economic reasons, but also because Russia has needed to do some reorientation since 2014. The extent to which that has been successful or not is a fascinating topic for another book.
Indeed.
But the fact that Putin can say, I meet with Xi at the bilateral level, we meet at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we meet at BRICS, we have bilaterals by the G20, it all feeds into the narrative of Russia as not isolated and not on its own, and that's incredibly important. The optic side of BRICS, particularly for Russia, is something that I think can be discounted as, oh, it's just a picture. But actually, optics and rhetoric are enormously important in international politics, and it's something that I think Putin has been very good at understanding and leveraging.
Great. Now, we're going to go out to the audience very briefly. I believe there are microphones that can reach you. So who has a question? I see there are 2 questions. I'm going to pick out Suman Berry. And at the table here, you had your hand up. So first Suman and then please. Suman, yes, thank you.
Thank you, David, and Rachel, thank you. I just would like you to reflect on when you talked about not getting in each other's way. How would you compare BRICS with ASEAN in terms of the rules of the road and in terms of achievement?
So BRICS and ASEAN, and now could we please take the microphone? No. Well, go ahead. We'll take your question, and then we'll come to the lady.
My name is Arvind Kumar.
We can't hear you.
Hello?
Yes.
My name is Arvind Kumar, and I will...
I'm sorry, I still can't
Hello?
hear you
We
at all.
can't hear you at all.
Hello?
Can you come up?
Come forward.
Hello? Is it?
Good.
Hello? My name is Arvind Kumar, and my name is Arvind Kumar, and I would pose one question, that among the BRIC nations, you see, most of the countries are trading with China, not among themselves. And then there are, I won't name the countries, but there are some actors, they have a proclivity to weaponize the interdependence.
Thank you.
Number one.
Now could we take the microphone to the lady in black? Do keep your hand up, please. Nobody can see that you're you.
I have one question or two, if you don't mind. First is, what do you think about the future of Eurasian Economic Union, which is started by Russia? And how do you see future of Ukrainian crisis? Will it become only one more frozen conflict in post-Soviet space? Thank you.
And I apologize to our guest and to the questioners. The rain is making sound levels difficult, but I think you caught the essence.
Well, I'm so glad you've all given me such softballs. It was very sporting of you. On the first question, I'm not an expert on ASEAN, but I would say that BRICS is still new. So to the extent that things that start as soft parts of global governance, if you will, and I would include the G7 there, as they mature, as they institutionalize, whether or not they actually develop secretariats and institutions, they become more effective, even if it's not their initial aim, at defining rules of the road within their remit. And the other thing I would say about that is all of the BRICS countries, I think much of where BRICS comes from, is 5 countries who have a dissatisfaction with how what we in the West like to term the liberal international order, how liberal it is, how international it is, and how ordered it is the topic of much debate. But a desire among these 5 risen, somewhere powers to become rule makers and not rule takers. So to the extent that they are effective at that, and that's one of the things I talk about towards the end of the book, I think might help sort of get to some of what you're asking. The second question was weaponizing interdependence by China, is that right? I have always said that looking at BRICS through an economic lens misses the point of BRICS. BRICS is not an economic group. It started in terms, if you look at the paper that Jim O'Neill wrote for Goldman Sachs in 2001, it's building better global economic BRICS. But the idea of the countries themselves when they came together was about geoeconomics, about representation in global economic governance. And there is certainly an effort at each BRICS summit to sign trade deals. But that is not what each country gets out of it. And I think that looking at the level of trade between each country tells you more about the dyad and the level of interdependence and the possibility of leveraging that interdependence in the dyad and in the bilateral relationship. And I would argue that BRICS is somewhat incidental to that. The only caveat is it does have, so I'm sorry, I'm not positive that this is still true, but when BRICS started, it was the only forum wherein Brazil sat in a small group with China. China has long been Brazil's largest trading partner. That's a real plus-up, power-wise, for Brazil, to be able to sit down with 4 other countries or 3 other countries instead of, all of Mercosur, right? So.
And the third?
Yes, and the third question, goodness me, future of the Eurasian Economic Union. Look, it's been kicking around for a really long time. It's an idea that started in 1994 by former President Nazarbayev. It's ebbed, it's sort of waxed. They're theoretically setting up a common customs border, common rules on enforcement, movement of people. I think it is much like many of the institutions Russia creates, and Russia has been the driving force even though it was a Kazakh idea. High prestige, low commitment, and impact on domestic affairs, right? Russia likes to join international groups that are prestigious but don't require changes in domestic law. So to the extent that actually building a truly functioning and strong Eurasian Economic Union, which if it was built would be great, requires a real harmonization of economic laws, if nothing else, I think is unlikely. And the future of the Ukraine crisis would eat up everyone else's time, but I think prospects are not rosy.
Great. Rachel, thank you so much. I hope the book gets republished in India. There are lots of publishers here, so put Georgetown Press onto it, because I think you'd have many readers here.
Thank you.
We're very privileged to have with us at this conference, and most of us have heard him several times already during the conference, Carl Bildt, who not only was a quasi-revolutionary leader of his country as the first conservative prime minister in decades, and one who reformed in depth the economy in ways that have helped Sweden ever since, in my view, although I'm sure there are people who would disagree with that. He then went on to play a very difficult, very important role in the life of the Balkans and the evolving situation in the Balkans, first for the European Union, then for the United Nations. This book looks forward, however, but I did want to ask you whether you think in the past, when you were working in Sweden and later when you were working as much outside Sweden as inside Sweden, you saw this developing disorder coming.
That's a good question. Did we see it coming? Clearly we didn't see it coming in the sense, in the form that it has come. Did we think that the glorious period and harmonious period of cooperation immediately after the end of the Cold War was going to last forever? Well, we were sort of hoping, but did we really believe it? No. I think we understood that at some point in time the world was going to do transition to another stage. But from the European point of view, and this is a book written, first it's in Swedish, so you have to have a crash course in Swedish first. It's a book written very much from a European perspective. And from the European perspective, our hope at that time was, of course, to build a much more functioning multilateral global order. And if we go back to the 90s in particular and away into the following decade, that was really the high point of these particular hopes. Russia was, for a while, a rather constructive partner on the international stage, no question about that. We had a good relationship with them. We sorted out some problems, not all. China was on a reform trajectory, and we set up the WTO in 1995, which had failed in the late 1940s, and integrated China into the WTO. So it was at the high point, really, of multilateralism and globalism and whatever you said. And I make the point in the book that these were extraordinary successful times for the world. In terms of Kofi Annan had the Millennium Development Goals, and when they were set, I think a lot of people thought that's overly optimistic. That's not going to be possible. But it's amazing how much was achieved. it might well have been the best quarter of a century for mankind in historical times. But then, of course, things started to go wrong. And I describe in the book, I put the pivot or the shift or whatever in 2008, when we saw the return of geopolitics, primarily the Georgia war. And I have a rather detailed account of what happened there and the background to that. Russia's trying to come back as a geopolitical actor. We had China. Remember the enormous opening of the Summer Olympics in Beijing that year? They had invested enormously in showing China is here, and China was there. And then, of course, we had, the onset of the Lehman Brothers and the international financial crisis. So 2008, from there you can say downhill. And then you have, from the European perspective again, you have the Brexit. 2016, you can add the election of Donald Trump later that year. And all of the issues that we are now dealing with, China, Russia, United States, where they're heading, what kind of Europe can we build in this very different global environment?
Indeed. Now, looking forward, what are you most worried about, both as a Swede, a former prime minister, but also a global citizen?
Well, of course, I'm worried about the fact that the mood in the West has to be said. I think it's different in somewhat other parts of the world. The mood has shifted from being optimistic to being apprehensive about the future. That means that politics tends to be defensive. The rise of identity politics, all of that, where you are building walls rather than bridges. You are building walls rather than tearing down walls between nations and inside nations as well, as we see in X numbers of nations. India is not excluded from this at the moment. And that is, of course, worrying, because that risks, if not destroying, then diluting those forces of integration and cooperation that has made it possible for the world to be as successful as we have been during some decades. Then we have to master, of course, the huge transition from the industrial to the digital age. The industrial age was built on fossil fuel. Without fossil fuel, it wouldn't exist. And it's very clear that that dependence has to be, if not eliminated completely, so at least to a very, very, very large extent, replaced with other sources of energy. And I think the digital transition, the tsunami of digital changes that we now see, will, as a matter of fact, help in that.
Great. Now, because I think members of the audience will want to engage you directly, I'm going to open this up to questions from all of you, because we've set the stage. This is a book about a worrying present and asking questions about the future. And so I'm sure the Prime Minister would welcome your questions. You have a second one, and your hand went up first. So could we get the microphone over here? And we should hear you more easily now that the rain is over.
The rain has subsided.
But do switch it on. We can't hear a thing. Thank you for your patience.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you. First, last time I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Ana Jovic-Lazic from Institute of International Politics and Economies, Belgrade, Serbia. I would like to ask one question. It's really very, I think that maybe you written in a book about that. But how rise of China and Trump presidency are affecting changes in the global order? It's first. And second is, I didn't have opportunity to ask a question on previous panel because time. And
I am afraid one question is enough.
Can I ask?
Other people want to intervene.
Okay, if someone else wants to ask.
So who would like to ask another question? Barney, did I see your hand up? No? Good. There. The gentleman in the exciting pink shirt there. Please keep your hand way up, otherwise the microphone won't find you. There.
Thank you.
Thank you. And identify yourself if you would.
Thank you. My name is Ameya Naik. I'm an associate fellow at the Takshila Institution. My question, I'm trying to connect something that has come up in panels yesterday as well, which is the extent to which the spike in migration, including the movement of refugees and asylum seekers in the recent past, because we can associate the spike with changes in Syria and Libya especially, has played into the kinds of tensions that you're speaking about. And, you know, any hope you can offer me on there might be a way to actually resolve this productively.
Great. Why
don't I take those two? I mean, first, the nature of the changing international order. Well, small question. But you can say that, go back to the Cold War period. The Cold War period was, I try to describe it as the kind of global order that came out of the sort of Atlantic Declaration in 1941. It was the Western order that was really dominated by the Anglo-Saxon powers, the Americans and the Brits, that was exceedingly successful. I mean, Soviet Union, socialist bloc went their own way, China as well. But you had the coming back of Europe, the rebuilding of Europe after the war, the coming back of Japan, solid democracies, all of that. But it was a divided world. Then we have the fall of that particular order, the fall of the entire socialist Soviet system, also opening up of the Indian economy. That was also important, that should not be forgotten. And then, as I said, then we had a period where the US was extraordinarily powerful. I don't think any nation in human history has been as powerful on the global stage, relatively speaking, as the United States was for a period. From the European point of view, we saw that as a fairly benevolent power. So we didn't see any fundamental contradiction between this enormous American power and the European effort at building a multilateral order. That turned out to be not entirely correct, because then we have the rise of the tensions. We have the Russians coming back, geopolitics, revisionist approach from them. We have a more assertive China. We have the building up of tension between the US and China. And now there's a talk about a multipolar order instead. You can hear that said here in India. And there's a fundamental difference between a multilateral order and a multipolar order. It sounds the same. But the multilateral order is essentially built on international law or rules-based order, even if Mr. Lavrov didn't like that term yesterday. While a multipolar order is actually built on the respective powers of the different poles. So it is, from the point of view of smaller states, a much more troubling situation. Now, there will be also sort of a mix between the two, because there are clearly issues that can't be sorted out only multipolar, that require still an element of multilateralism. But there's no question that it's swinging in that direction. And that's also the disturbing question for Europe, what to do. Refugee was, of course, a big issue, has always been a big issue for Europe, but because we are where we are. And the 2015 refugee crisis had a big impact. It had a big impact not primarily because of numbers. We talk about 1 million people. At sort of 0.2% of the population of the European Union. So the numbers would have been manageable. And it is nearly as many as we have during an ordinary year anyhow, moving into Europe. But it happened very suddenly, and there weren't preparations for it, and there was the feeling among people in the most effective country that things were breaking down. And that created what I think Ivan Krastev has called sort of the 9/11 of the politics of Europe, with profound political effects, and we are still dealing with the aftershocks of that. Can that be managed? Well, a lot of different efforts are underway in order to sort out the European system. It's not much better in terms of both border management, in terms of reach out to Turkey and Africa and whatever. And then, of course, it is dependent upon, at the end of the day, us being able to be somewhat more successful in both sorting out crisis. The Syrian crisis is still there. We have in the order of sort of 4 million people in Idlib. And there's roughly 250,000 of them that are on the move somewhere. There's a danger of, this is one of the reasons why, of course, Europeans are less than happy with the escalation between the US and Iran. A war between the two of them is a war in our neighborhood, and we know what that has its effect. Afghanistan, there's still a lot of refugees from that. And then, of course, we have the entire African situation that impacts upon Europe. One of the demography comes into the picture. One of the most telling, I mean, if you look at the African development, the year 2000, not that long ago, there were roughly the same number of people in the European Union and in all of Africa, roughly 500 million. That's no longer the case. Africa is growing very fast. And by the end of this century, according to UN prognosis, 40% of all working age people in the world, 40% of all working age people in the world will be in Africa. Will Africa be able to have the economic development and the political stability to sustain this? Remains to be seen. But European migration policies must be pursued also in the perspective of potential mess in the Middle East and the demographic challenge of Africa. We live in a neighborhood that is, we are not surrounded by oceans as the Americans are.
Now, I'm going to take 2 more, and then, unfortunately, given the rapid-fire format of which I think is a successful one, of these meetings, we'll need to pass on to Karthik. Please, sir, at the first table here, the gentleman with his hand up.
Hello, my name is Vuk Jeremic from Belgrade. The follow-up question on the previous one, what happens if there is an escalation soon and there is a migration wave coming out of Erdogan fulfilling one of his threats, or there is an explosion of some sort in the Middle East, and actually people massively start, like in 2015, going along, say, the Western Balkans route towards Europe? What happens short term? Does Europe let
I
them
think we get the point. Thank you. Now, the gentleman in the jacket, the dark jacket here, right behind. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, Prime Minister. I'm Pete Gumatalto. I'm the director of the Daniel K. New Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. It's a mouthful. It's over in Hawaii. I have to admit I did not read your book, but we're talking about disorder.
That's okay.
Sir, I will, though. Disorder and today's complex society in terms of the environment. Can you comment on the implications of the ability, and by the way, it's not just Xi Jinping or President Trump, there is a new, the tip of the iceberg, the ability to influence and the leveraging of not just social media, technology, but also the rapid artificial intelligence, super quantum computing. Did you highlight that a lot in the complexity of the world that you depicted in the 21st century? Thank you.
First, returning to the refugee issue, say that we were to get sort of a new war in the Middle East, which is likely. There's always a new war in the Middle East. Can we handle that better than in 2015? The answer is yes. But there will be strain, no question about that. But we now have sort of border surveillance, border facilities, procedures for handling things that are very much better than 2015. There are still sort of problems and challenges, be that in southern Italy or be that on the Greek islands in order to handle it, but we would do it far, far better than 2015. No question about that. But the key thing is, of course, to prevent it. And there we have the dialogue with Turkey. Turkey is feeling the strain. only Istanbul has more Syrian refugees than all of the rest of Europe taken together. And even if it's a big city and there's more cultural commonality perhaps, no question that is a strain. Then the big issues of technology and their impact. See if we can handle the rain as well. Yeah, I deal to some extent with that from a couple of different angles. First is the battle that is there for the control of the technologies of the future. As I said in the opening session here, look at the beginning of the industrial age, which were the powers that had the control of the technologies that were defining the industrial age. It was first Britain and then the United States. And that had its consequences. Who will control the technologies that will dominate the digital age? At the moment, that is looked like a battle between the United States and China, with the United States being the incumbent and China being the very determined challenger. And that is going to have a tremendous impact upon the global order in the decades and perhaps centuries to come. Who really becomes dominant? It's not going to be digital black and white, but who becomes dominant in that particular battle. So that's also part of that is in the book as well. Not the solution. That will be your next book, I guess.
Carl, you've been a wonderful guest. It's clearly a very exciting book, and I do hope it will come out in English, French, Russian, Chinese, and other languages.
And also, I just say that I'm also on the advisory board of the ORF. So one of the things that we're going to do next year is we're going to have more book presentation and also the possibility of buying the books in question. So there will be sort of a much greater emphasis on books and these sort of discussions next year.
Fantastic, Carl. Thank you very much, and good luck with the book. Now, a word about the rain. It may be inconvenient for us. For hundreds of thousands of Indian farmers, this is very good news. So we should be celebrating the rain. And we're very lucky to have with us Syed, who spoke yesterday on the panel. Thank you for joining us today. Karthik, amidst this din, you have a wonderful title, and I suspect it's tongue-in-cheek. So let's start with your title. For those of you who don't know Karthik, he did a brilliant PhD at King's College London, and he is currently with the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, one of the best global centers of South Asian studies. So Karthik, over to you on the origins and purpose of the book relative to the title.
Let me first begin by thanking ORF.
Louder.
Sorry, let me first begin by thanking ORF for having me here. So the book flows out of my PhD dissertation, which looks at one question. Why is there a variation in India's attitudes toward international rules? It is very keen to negotiate and sign certain rules. It is lukewarm and not as interested in other rules. And it downright rejects certain rules vehemently. So why do we see this variation, and how can that be explained? If you look at the literature on India's multilateral behavior, it's generally unhelpful in answering this question because it paints India as a very defensive, prickly negotiator and more of a naysayer. If that was true, then India would not be signing a lot of the agreements that it negotiates. But the reality is that India signs about 80 to 85% of the multilateral agreements that it's negotiated in the last 30 or 40 years. So why does that happen? So I unpacked, so I was trying to sift through the various explanations, and the one that made sense to me was looking at the domestic political economy around how India negotiates, looking at the institutions, the bureaucracy, the interest groups, and the various actors that have a stake in the rule being negotiated, and how they influence that process. And that's what the book tackles through 4 different issues. Trade, the Uruguay Round Trade Agreement, tobacco control, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, climate change, and nuclear disarmament.
Great. Let me challenge you a bit on some of this. I'm sure you're right in your figures that 80 to 85% of the negotiations India engages in, it winds up with an agreement. But there was a recent one where, a bit to the surprise of other participants in the forum, India backed off, and rather noisily. And that was RCEP. Could you, and you would know all about it. So could you tell us a bit about that and why you think, to the surprise of many of its negotiating partners, India did back off?
Right. So I've been writing about the RCEP for the last little while. So we still are constrained by the fact that the actual negotiating processes have not been released yet. So they're the official documents of what happened are not out in the public. So what we have been going by is anecdotal evidence from some of the negotiators and reporting. So from what I've gathered, RCEP was different in a couple of ways, which I think eventually compelled India to reject it, for now at least. The first was that most multilateral trade agreements have certain exemptions that are strewn into them, especially for developing countries like India, to allow them to adjust before they open up the markets to foreign goods and services. RCEP did not have sufficient exemptions or import caps within it that would please India, which would also left it more open for Chinese goods to flood the market and protect itself. So that's one reason. The second is that there were a few issues related to services. One is the investment settlement dispute mechanism, and the other was a chapter on data. And in both these areas, India was not happy with the provisions that were being negotiated, particularly on the investment, on the investor settlement side, given their unfriendly experiences with Enron and some of the other foreign companies. They were not open to having them take the Indian government to court. And on data, since India is in the process of coming up with its own regulations to manage and protect data, sort of giving a multilateral agreement enough sway in that process looked, somewhat foolish. So on both goods and services, I argue that there were enough reasons for India to remain wary and reject the agreement for now.
Great. Now, where does this take you? Beyond this book, India does negotiate a tremendous amount. It's tremendously active diplomatically around the world. In Asia, where it used to be somewhat recalcitrant, in spite of Nehru's ideal of Asia, today it's all over the place, very positively, I think, overall. Where do you think this is leading, if it's leading anywhere? And is multilateral negotiation just not a form that India is ultimately all that comfortable with?
Well, I don't think India has a choice. And you're seeing now that there are a lot of technology issues that are emerging to be regulated at the global level. And India is going to be part of each of those negotiations. But I think fundamentally, and this is one of the arguments in the book, is that India has grown more interdependent with the international order over the last 30 years because of its economy. And its interests have grown relative to growth and how embedded it is in the international economy. So it has no choice but to actively engage, learn more about the issues being negotiated, devise stances that are, rational and, but also serve their interests. So it's going to be, you're going to see more of an India now in the international order than ever before, because as India's importance and size in the international economy gets bigger, it's in its interest to remain a rule shaper, as I argue in the book, and not necessarily a rule taker or a rule breaker.
Great. Now, at this particular Raisina meeting, we haven't heard so very much about Singapore. And as you're living there, I wanted to ask you about Singapore's particular role in having branded itself in part on the strength of its universities, of the knowledge creation that goes on in Singapore, which relates to China, relates to India, relates to all sorts of parts of Asia and the world beyond, and why you chose to be in Singapore, because I know you had a choice.
Well, so Singapore is a great place to study India, and there's a big intellectual community, particularly on the strategic side and on the economic side now, to understand India's rise more broadly, and not just in the Indo-Pacific, but in a more global manner. And there's enough, there's a vibrant and growing intellectual community there to engage with on India's rise and role in the international order. And the other reason is that Singapore-India relations are and have been growing for the last 2 decades. Singapore, as I'm not sure many people would know, is the largest foreign investor in India, and it's deeply interested in not just what's happening in Delhi, but also various states, and it's actively engaging states as well, with respect to investment and other issues. So and India is also trying to do the same, engaging Singapore, in terms of innovation and how Singapore is urbanized, and what lessons one can draw from that experience and bring back as India urbanizes rapidly as well. So there is an interdependence on the intellectual side, on the political side, and on the intellectual side as well. Yeah, it's a great book.
Well, now let's turn to the audience and see who would like to engage you on anything he's raised, or pretty well anything else. Now, who would like to ask a question, sir? You had your hand up? Yeah, here, please. And if you could be quite brief in your question.
I will make
please, microphone.
Brief observations. I was part of the government for almost 35 years, and I will give my comments that why India, given its size, we are not able to leverage it in negotiations. Number one, you see, in most of the countries, you see trade policy division, or like in America, you have USTR. In India, we have just 12 people who look after multilateral trade. And in fact, I was part of 2 negotiations with Thailand and Chile. Now I will tell you the problem. Like when we started negotiating with Chile, Chile is one country where there is just one single import tariff rate, which is just 5%. And in case of India, our peak tariff was 15% and multiplicity. We found it extremely difficult, and we were always thinking that in the process we would be giving more. Second, you see, when about Singapore, Singapore was willing to open its services sector professionals. But why I think it did not materialize, that Singapore insisted that they would only recognize degrees from select institutions, which is maybe IITs and top notch, which was something which for any government it won't be easy to accept.
Good. Let's come back to Karthik on those 2 points.
So I think there are more comments than questions. On the trade side, I think you were referring to trade negotiations. I track, one trade agreement that India negotiated, which was the Uruguay round, and I spoke with a lot of negotiators from the Ministry of Commerce and how they went about doing so. I think, having maybe a big delegation at multilateral negotiations is not necessarily a strength as it's, said to be. Sometimes a smaller, more knowledgeable, more cohesive, set of negotiators within a delegation can be as effective, if not more, in pursuing your interests. On Singapore, I wasn't sure. Was that a question or a comment?
Somewhere in between.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to respond to that.
Well, don't worry. Then don't respond, and we'll go to the gentleman with his hand up there in beige. Please, the microphone. Could you please?
Hi, Karthik. My name is Raghutam. One of the symbols that I see in the title of the book is the atomic energy symbol. I don't know which part of atomic negotiations you studied, whether it was the early part, in Nehru's time or later. But what's the broad picture of the nature of India's negotiations in the atomic issues?
Anybody else? The lady in the back row, please.
Thank you. Tanya Spisbar from the Australia-India Institute. I've also negotiated with India bilaterally and in the World Trade Organization as well, and was part of the RCEP negotiations. I wanted to ask, you mentioned India as a rule shaper rather than a rule taker, but can you shape rules if you're not part of them or governed by them? And in what extent can you influence if you're not willing to be part of the system?
Great. I think 2 very interesting questions for you, Karthik, to round out the
So
session.
the nuclear case, the chapter looks at the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which was negotiated in the early 90s. So I track, how India negotiated that agreement in Geneva, and I link that up with the domestic politics around the agreement in India, but particularly there was a lot of discussion amongst the strategic community here in New Delhi, and so I track what their views were and how they influenced the policy making. So the existing sort of understanding on the CTBT was domestic politics, prevented India from signing the agreement and eventually abstaining from it at the UN. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think that the role that the MEA played and the understanding of the diplomats who were negotiating the agreement was far stronger and far more insulated from the strategic studies community, and they were essentially able to, at the early part of the negotiations, they were kind of keen to have India, enter the agreement and sign it, even though it would have prevented them from testing a nuclear weapon, because they felt at that point there was sufficient, deterrent capabilities in India which would not require them to test a weapon. But over time, as the NPT got extended indefinitely, that really changed the approach of the MEA, and because there was a lot of people within the strategic committee who wanted India to sign the agreement, despite the NPT being extended. So I track, how the MEA officials went about, not just, staking a claim in Geneva, but also sort of not being too overly influenced by what was happening in New Delhi. On RCEP, again, So in two of the three cases in the book, and I argue that India was a rule shaper, and it's easier to be a rule shaper when you eventually sign the agreement, right? Because your interests are reflected in the agreement, and you're at peace with what's in it, and which would eventually allow you to sign and ratify it. But in RCEP, I think it was more of a rule breaker because, the interest groups, if you use the framework that I, have relied on in the book, there was sufficient domestic consternation amongst a variety of interest groups from the services side and the goods side that the negotiators essentially had no other way to, sign the agreement. So there was sufficient capacity, strong capacity within the negotiating team because they have been doing this for over 7 years and like 30 plus rounds. But eventually I think what they could not get over was that those few provisions which I underlined that did not fit the interests of the various lobby groups that were actively pressuring the Ministry of Commerce and the other RCEP negotiators. Yeah, I hope that answered your question in some way. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Karthik. You raise here the really important point that India has lobbies of its own. It's not just other countries that have them. And they are often harder for foreigners to discern, I think, than they are in other countries because they aren't always organized into clearly identifiable groups. So congratulations on the book. I hope it leads you on to further study of this area. We've had 3 really exciting books. Carl, I really hope yours comes out in English and other languages. It deserves to. Meanwhile, your Swedish compatriots are lucky. Rachel, it's, for in a country like India, it's a fantastic subject, and I hope one of the local publishing houses picks up on a book that's already in English and would be easy to transfer. And Karthik, you're at home here in every way, so I'm sure the book will do very well. Ritika, thank you very much to you, your colleagues, the ones carrying the microphones, those providing lunch, and the gods of the weather, which have produced both adverse conditions for the speakers, but fantastic opportunities for the farmers. Thank you all very, very much.